Hi, I'm Jessica Pauline. I'm the Assistant Director of Publicity at Princeton University Press. Today I'm joined by Ed Berger, who is the co-author with Mike Starbird of 5 Elements of Effective Thinking, which we'll publish later in 2012. So, my first question always is, why did you write this book?
We wrote this book to allow people to get the most out of their education. So many people today think that, well, I'm done with school, therefore my education is over. And this book is trying to celebrate the reality that our education is never over. But what do you do when you're no longer in school? You no longer have your teachers, your professors, the faculty there, the curriculum. This is a book that gives you action items to tell you how to become your own Socrates, how to be your own teacher, how to get more out of what you are.
So what exactly are the 5 elements of effective thinking?
The 5 elements of effective thinking include the importance of deep understanding. The idea that understanding comes in layers, and wherever you are in the scale and the spectrum of understanding, there's always greater and deeper understanding to go. Everyone thinks sometimes that understanding is an on and off switch, a yes or no proposition, but it's not. So even the greatest minds can think even deeper. And a student that at the very basic level needs to challenge him or herself to actually see that there's greater understanding to come and not be satisfied with a superficial understanding. Then there's this idea of failing, the power of failing. A lot of people talk about how important failing is, but we tell you how to fail. So we give you specific action items that you can do that will guarantee that you will fail. But as a result, it also guarantees a next step, a step toward innovation, a step to a new insight, a step to an epiphany, an aha moment. Then there's the notion of creating questions. If you put yourself in a position where you train yourself to constantly be thinking of questions, whether someone's speaking to you, whether you're at a lecture, whether you're looking at a work of art, whether you're hearing a piece of music, you will actually see things that otherwise you would miss because you have a different inner life experience. All of a sudden you're going deeper. You're forcing yourself to say, gee, what can I ask here? What's going on? What's the core ideas? And all of a sudden you're making the invisible visible. Then there's this notion of the flow of ideas, that every single idea doesn't happen in a vacuum, as so many times people and students see the world. I have to memorize this fact and that fact and that fact and that fact and then reproduce it for a test. Well, by that method, you don't see the sense of the topic. But by seeing that every idea had a predecessor, it came from somewhere, and that every time you see a new idea, it leads to another new idea. And your challenge, when you're faced and given a new idea, is to ask, what can I do now? Where does that lead me? All of a sudden, you become innovative. So those are the 4 elements. And then the 5th one is basically all of them put together. The fact that we can change. The fact that at the core of education is the goal of transforming lives. And by embracing these 4 mindsets, we can, in fact, transform our lives and become more thoughtful, more innovative, more creative, and more provocative thinkers.
And I know that in the book you've developed a scheme to make these particularly memorable and useful in people's lives. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, it's so easy to remember. When Mike and I were working on this book, we were always having trouble memorizing them. We had a top 10 list. So there were 10 of them. And even though Mike and I spoke all over the world on these things and everyone really liked them, sometimes I had trouble memorizing all 10. I couldn't recite all 10. So we broke it down to 5, and then we thought of a great way of remembering it. So all you have to do is remember the classical Greek elements that were thought to be the foundation for everything, which include earth, fire, air, water. And so earth is under where you stand. So understanding, rock solid understanding is represented by earth. Fire is failing, of course. It's scary and no one wants to go into it, but really we should embrace it. Questions sometimes come out of thin air. So air is connected to questions. And then, of course, the flow of ideas is associated with water. Now, there was actually a 5th element in the ancient Greek system of the universe, and that was the quintessential element, which was this unchanging, rock-solid kind of everything. Here, paradoxically, the quintessential element is that we are capable of change. And then by embracing these other 4 elements, we can, in fact, see difference. We can, in fact, transform ourselves. So it's a great way of remembering them. All you have to do is remember earth, fire, air, water, and the quintessential element.
So some people may be surprised to learn that you and your co-author are actually mathematicians by training. Can you explain how the book came out of your mathematics background?
Absolutely. You know, every single discipline and every single subject that we teach in the academy at any level offers thinking and life lessons. And it's just a matter of how much we want to exploit and celebrate those. So often in the curriculum today, we see syllabi that are so filled with stuff and facts and notation and language and algorithms that the thinking gets buried. So when Mike and I have been trying to put together meaningful educational experiences in mathematics, we realize that for those students that aren't going to become PhD professors, mathematicians, that math itself is an empty promise because you're going to let the quadratic formula go. In fact, many of my students let it go before the final exam. So that's not the life lesson. We began to realize that there's a way of thinking. There's a way of thinking that Mike and I think just as mathematicians that in fact transcend mathematics and allow us to problem solve. What do you do when you don't know what to do? Well, thinking mathematically, and in that context, thinking in any way, thinking philosophically, thinking anthropologically, so forth, offers answers. And what we did was we took that long body of experience, way too long, of teaching experience that both Mike and I have amassed over these many, many years. We're very, very old. And we put that together and we distilled out the thinking and we removed the math. So this is not a math book at all, but we've taken the thinking strategies that one can find and realize that in fact they transcend everything and can inform how you look at art, how you look at a piece of literature, how you analyze poetry, how you understand or build a particular piece of software, how you build a building, how you look at a society, how you organize a business. Everything can be moved by embracing these. And so in some sense, it represents part of the core of how to just think. And that's what we try to do.
So your book isn't just for students and people in classrooms. I mean, that's an important part of the audience, but who else do you think will benefit from the book?
Well, certainly any student who wants to get the most out of his or her education will get something out of this. But every single teacher, professor at every level, from kindergarten all the way up through postgraduate, that wants to take their teaching to even a more profound and deeper level than they already have, which for a lot of teachers is difficult to imagine. But still, part of the book is that there's always more for us to grow and learn. Parents that want to offer their children the most out of their education and that value education. Professionals, people that want to innovate more in the workplace, whether it's for them or leaders in business and leaders in the world of commerce, where they say, I want to inspire my team to think more imaginatively and free them to fail and whatnot. And then finally, lifelong learners. People that are saying, you know what, my formal education is over, but I still need to grow. There's more left for me to do. There's more left for me to conquer. Those people will probably enjoy the book as well. So it's a very, very tiny audience. Just every student, just every teacher at all levels, just every professional, and just every lifelong learner. So I'm hoping that, within that limited market, we will do okay.
We'll try our best.
Thank you.
So let's delve into some of the elements specifically. So starting with Earth, understanding. In the book, you have a lot of anecdotes and examples and action items for people. Can you just kind of give us maybe one of your favorite anecdotes of this element at work?
So with understanding, one of my favorite action items is the action item of add the adjective, where you take a look at a scenario, a circumstance, or something physical, and then try to describe it. Just use words to describe it. And that's how you begin to see things that you would have already have missed otherwise, by just trying to articulate what it is that you see, literally see, whether it's an abstract idea or whether it's an actual physical realm that you can look at. By articulating what you see, all of a sudden you see things differently. For example, one of the things we talk about is when the big conflict ended in around 1918, 1919, what did we call that? Well, we called it the Great War, or, even worse, the War to End All Wars. What a dumb title that was, but that's what we called it. Well, what if we called it, back then, World War I? By adding that adjective of World War I, you're providing an opportunity to say, gee, this might be the first of many. And all of a sudden now your mind races and begins to think about things differently. So that's just one simple example of an action item that you can take. Whenever you're seeing a circumstance, force yourself to add an adjective. Even if you think it's silly, mundane, not interesting, it will always uncover something that you would have otherwise missed.
I think you also have a great example in that particular chapter about the development of the shopping cart.
The shopping cart is a great example where you don't think about, gee, where's the history of the shopping cart written down? Well, it's in this book. So if you're a shopping cart connoisseur, this is a must-have book to your collection. But yeah, I mean, before there were shopping carts, people shopped, they would just kind of hold it in their hands and they would carry it around and walk through the very, very small grocery store. It wasn't like a superstore that we have today. And then one day a businessman said, you know what? I bet you that if I can create a device so they could actually carry more things, I would sell more things. What an obvious, straightforward, simple thing. And what he did was he took basically a chair, he put wheels on the bottom of it, and he affixed a basket to it, and all of a sudden the shopping cart was born. And all of a sudden his sales skyrocketed because people had a place to put the product. So again, we're not offering very deep and profound per se. The consequences are deep and profound. The implications are deep and profound. But in fact, it's very, very straightforward what you have to do. And by embracing just the idea of understanding what's the idea here, how do I increase and improve my business model? Well, I need people to buy more things. I need to have them carry more things. Ah, great. And there's the birth of the shopping cart.
All right, so let's move on to the second element, which is perhaps the scariest and the least popular, talking about failure, which is associated with fire in the book.
And that's my favorite, by the way. So that's the most popular in my eyes. I love talking about failure. And every time I speak to groups or companies or schools, that's the one they want to talk about.
So in the book, you talk about how failure actually is responsible for something that's ubiquitous in every office space, the Post-it. So can you kind of talk about that and then maybe give us an action item that we all can practice at home to kind of increase our comfort level with failure?
So the 3M's a great invention of the Post-it note, which is probably their greatest product ever, and certainly the most used thing in anyone's office, really came about because of a mistake. There was a scientist at 3M who was trying to create a sticky product, right? I mean, they're all about tape. 3M is all about tape. And the product was a huge failure because this concoction, this recipe, wasn't very sticky at all. In fact, it had the feature that once you pressed it down, you could actually just lift it right up. Well, what kind of tape is that? So it was just kind of shelved, and that was it. Well, a little bit later, there was a colleague of this scientist who was trying to put bookmarks in his hymnal so that he could find places. And the bookmarks kept falling out. So he wanted to kind of affix the place marks in without damaging the hymnal. And he remembered, hey, what about that, my colleague's, crazy failed attempt? And he kind of lathered some of this sticky, concoction on, and it stuck to the hymnal, and then it would come right off. And then all of a sudden people said, aha, now we see what to do. So that's an example. So we talk about failure in many, many different directions. That's an example of how a failed attempt to do one thing might be a brilliant insight into doing something else. So there's an example of that. But in terms of an action item for failing, one thing that we say is if you have to do something that's really hard, whether it's writing a paper, whether it's dealing with a report, dealing with a committee, working at something business in school, if you got to do it really quickly, really poorly. Just do it. Just sit down and just do it. And you're going to produce junk and garbage. But within that mess, you might find gems. And all of a sudden, it will start to organize your thinking and your ideas. And now you iterate. And now you begin a process of refining and refining and failing and failing. And all of a sudden, bang, you've got it. And in fact, that literally is how he wrote the book. This book, which only has 160 some odd pages, took us over 7 years to write. If you figure that out, how many pages per day, it's ridiculous. But the idea is that by iterating, we were able to produce something that we thought was the right thing for us to produce.
So I'm going to jump into questions and air now. A large portion of this section is about formulating the right questions. And how do you go about doing that? So can you give us another anecdote and then again another action item? And I'm actually I have a preference here for the action item related to the election.
Well, first of all, questions are an important way of going through life. And asking the right question or even the wrong question, just creating questions produces a different inner life experience. One thing that I do in my classroom is I actually pick at the beginning of each class, each lecture, an individual at random out of like a deck of cards who are going to be the official questioners of the day. And their job is to ask at least one question during the lecture, even if they didn't think they had one. It forces them to treat that class in a different way. They have to really pay attention, they have to really think, and all of a sudden they're engaged at a richer level. So that's the power of questions. having the answers sometimes isn't even as important as being in the habit of creating the questions, quite frankly. So it's kind of a paradox. We're not saying you have to do the questions solely to get the answer, but in fact the question is a way in itself because it allows you to all of a sudden see things that you might be able to answer on your own. In terms of elections, there's a lot of heady times that follow that precede any election, and whether it's at the state level or the federal level or any kind of level. And there's a lot of hyperbole and a lot of advertising and sound bites. And so, when you have your candidate, it is your civic responsibility to actually create the right questions to make sure that they are, in fact, truly representing that which you believe, those philosophies that you embrace, and not to just take the 30-second soundbite and the little commercial, but to really say, okay, what's the right question to ask this candidate, and ask the candidate and get that answer. And that helps us actually generate an informed citizenry.
So the fourth element, which is understanding the flow, that ideas flow from one to the other, this is a multi-directional flow. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think a lot of people think ideas exist in the here and now. So if you could elaborate on that, that would be wonderful.
It's great because, when you teach anything, especially math, you often get the kind of question, how did anyone ever come up with this? Well, the fact that someone would even ask that question, which is a very natural question, the way we teach things, it basically shows that we have stripped, as teachers, we have stripped away all the humanity, all the actual natural progression that led to that idea, and instead just offered it in the slickest, coolest, most direct, polished way. Ideas do become more polished, but the thing is, then you lose kind of where they came from. It's so important to realize how an idea came into being. It actually makes it easier. Sometimes students say, well, it's just easier for me to memorize the formulas. Well, it might seem that way on paper, but without that meaning, which comes from understanding where the formulas came from, how they derived, why they were created to begin with. Now, all of a sudden, there's a story in my head, and a story is a lot easier to remember than random quantum little facts that I just have to hold in my head and that are independent to each other. Now there's a storyline, an intellectual story that allows me to kind of actually feed off itself and say, now I see, of course that's where it is. So that's why it's important to understand where ideas came from, going into an idea, but then once you're in the here and now, in today's society, the common practice is, hey, I've got a new idea. Let's get balloons and a cake and celebrate. But that's the place, if you embrace the mindset that Mike Starbird and I are proposing, that's the place where the work begins. That's the moment you start working. You have a new idea, either new to you or someone else's idea that you first see. The first thing you say is, this is really interesting. What else can I do with it now? Where does it lead me to? What can I do? By doing that, by having that mindset, all of a sudden now you're innovating into the future. So there's a flow from the past, which allows you to understand the present better. So you'll just do better in school and you'll have better understanding and a richer understanding. And once you see a new idea, by forcing yourself to say, what can I do next, allows you to begin to innovate into the future.
Okay, and now the part that is probably going to be the most difficult, the fifth element, the quintessential element, change. I think that this is where a lot of people get hamstrung, basically, when they're trying to improve the way that they're thinking. So can you talk about how you help people get over that hump in the book?
This is where the rubber meets the road, because the quintessential element of change really just says, do the other four things. But this is a way to kind of remind you that something different is going to happen. A lot of times people today tend to be somewhat solid in how they look at the world and unmoving. And what we're trying to propose is an intellectual agility that allows you to say, you know what, I now see things differently and I now change. I change my mind, I change my thinking, I change what I believe because I see new evidence or because I see a new argument or because I just see things differently. And it's the lifelong learner, it's the person who's evolving that is open to actually say, you know what, I can change. And it's not a sign of weakness. In fact, it's a great sign of strength to say, you know what, I am a different person. I am a changed person. That's the point of education. But it's hard to do, and you have to embrace it, and you have to realize that it's not bad. You watch these pundits talk on these, television programs, these news-type programs. It doesn't make a difference whether it's on the right-leaning channels or the left-leaning channels. It doesn't matter who's even speaking. If you watch that national discussion, that national debate on TV, that are, of course, going for ratings, the conversation is always the same. I'm right, I'm right, I'm right, and you're arguing, no, 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 you're right, you're right, you're right. And it goes back and forth. And you never hear in that discourse, in that debate, someone say, well, that's a good point. Okay, I'll give you that.
You've changed my mind.
Exactly. People are stubborn and they don't want to change. But that is not the informed mindset. And if you look back as to how even our own government worked in years past, even though people had different philosophical views on government and politics, they would come together and they would compromise and they would actually change to allow the betterment of whatever the issue is. And today there's a frustration because people are afraid to change or don't want to change. And what we try to argue and invite in this last chapter is that it's not only okay to change, but it is critical to change. And Mike and I both have changed so much over the years. Our teaching has evolved. It literally led to this book. And we're so proud that we can actually offer kind of this voice. But it's because of change. And so once we look at change, just like failure, people look at failure and say, oh, that's weak, that's bad. But in fact, instead of saying change, oh, you're wishy-washy, but instead, no, thoughtful, careful, decided change allows us to grow into just better selves.
So in the book, you instruct your readers to read this book not once, but 3 times. Why is that?
Well, first of all, it's an invitation. We don't instruct anything. These are suggestions. And what we really wanted to do originally, we had this innovative idea of literally having the book be 3 times as thick and just repeating the book 3 times. So it'd be really, really thick and, maybe even more expensive, which would be, But you guys said no. Princeton University Press vetoed that idea. Right. So we had to put in the preamble that are instructions and suggestions to read the book 3 times. Because, in fact, change is hard, So the first read, just read it through kind of casually, skim, read the parts you want, kind of get a sense of the big picture. Because there are these 5 elements, and it's not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but they're all interconnected. In fact, if you look at kind of the neat symbol we have, they all kind of are together. And so they all work with each other. And so you want to get a kind of global sense of all of the stuff. So now all of it's in your head. You have the 5 elements in your head. Now read it a second time. And now read it with a little more care and try to stop at each of the action items that we suggest and try to apply it to something. By the way, the fantasy for this book, in my mind, is that after you read the book 3 times, you kind of put it on the shelf or ideally keep it on your desk. And whenever you come across a vexing problem or an issue or something that you want to resolve, just pick up the book, open it up to a random page, find the nearest action item, wherever it is, and now apply it. Because it will be applicable, whatever it is. These action items are action items that apply to anything. So, this second read through and think about the action items, try them out, and you'll see that, wow, they really do kind of help. And then the third read is what we call the transformative read. This is maybe the hardest one, because you now have to read it and begin to try to make these things part of who you are. Put these things into practice and make them actually part of how you think and live your life. And that's the hard one. But we think that in 3 reads, you'll be kind of well on your way to being the absolute coolest, best, strongest, smartest, most imaginative, creative person that you are capable of being. And by the way, wherever an individual is, including you and me, quite frankly, we can be even greater. And that, I think, is maybe the greatest triumph of the human spirit. That wherever we are, wherever our lot in life is, intellectually or otherwise, we can, by intent, change and be even more, be even greater. And this book tries to offer something in the direction of that conversation.
Thank you very much for joining me today. I hope that everybody enjoyed this conversation with Ed Berger, the co-author with Mike Starbird of 5 Elements of Effective Thinking. Thank you.